We got an early disconnect tonight. Okay, back to chapter 5, verse 1 there. It says, Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, but forasmuch as he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given unto the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel. And the genealogy is not to be reckoned after the birthright. For Judah prevailed above his brethren, and of him came the chief ruler. But the birthright was Joseph. So remember that the focus of the book of 1 Chronicles is about God's choice for King David. And that's what the main central character of 1 Chronicles is going to be. And so the note is mentioned that even though Reuben is the firstborn, verse 2 tells you, well, number 1, you're told the sons of Joseph that he got the firstborn's blessing, meaning he got the double portion. And so Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, they end up being tribes themselves. So you have the basically 11 sons of Israel, plus the 2 grandchildren of Israel, or the 2 sons of Joseph, making a total of 13. That's the first point. And the second point is more in line with what 1 Chronicles is telling you, is that Judah prevailed above his brethren, and of him came the chief ruler. The chief ruler being David. And so even though Reuben is the firstborn, you'd expect him to be the prominent figure. It's telling you, no, because he sinned, Joseph got the firstborn's blessing, and then the kingly line starts through the tribe of Judah, and where David comes from. So that point is made right off the bat there in chapter 5. Now when we go to chapter 6 then, now we're given the genealogy of the sons of Levi and the cities that they dwelt in. The sons of Levi were the priestly tribe. God set them apart. Remember when God sent the 10 plagues upon the nation of Egypt to get Israel out of Egypt, said to Pharaoh, let my people go, that he had the last plague was the death of the firstborn of all in Egypt. And as a result, God says, well, I require the firstborn of all of Israel to belong to me. But in place of that, I'll take, and he ends up taking, basically trades them in, you could say, although they do have to have a firstborn sacrifice but to redeem it. But anyway, he ends up getting the tribe of Levi, and the Levites serve in the doing the Lord's work, basically in the temple and around that. And so chapter 6 gives you their genealogy that they dwelt in. Notice in chapter 6, verses 31 through 47, you're told of the singers in the house of the Lord during David's day and their genealogy. There are 3 singers specifically mentioned, and I mention these because they all ended up writing psalms that are actually in Scripture. Verse 33, chapter 6, verse 33, and these are they that waited with their children of the sons of the Kohathites, Heman, a singer, the son of Joel, the son of Shemiel. So you thought Heman was the master of the universe. Actually, he was first a singer. Heman was a singer, and he wrote Psalm chapter 88. Then in verse 39, the second singer mentioned, says, and his brother Asaph, who stood on his right hand, even Asaph, the son of Berechiah, the son of Shimei, he ended up writing 12 psalms. He wrote Psalm 50, and then also Psalms 73 through 83. So he wrote Psalm 50 and Psalm 83. And then the third singer mentioned is in verse 44. It says, and their brethren, the sons of Merari, stood on the left hand, Ethan, the son of Kishai, the son of Abdi, the son of Malach. And Ethan wrote Psalm 89. So it's interesting to know that, especially when we get a little later, we'll see when David writes a psalm exactly what the psalms, the purpose of the psalms were. And then the rest of the chapter in chapter 6 from verses 54 through 81 cover all the cities that the Levites dwelt in. So then we get to chapter 7, and you have a lot of the remaining tribes are mentioned, their genealogy. You have the family of Issachar in verses 1 through 5 of chapter 7. You have the family of Benjamin, verses 6 through 12. You have the sons of Naphtali. He only gets one verse there, verse 13, but they do give you their genealogy. And then, remember I mentioned that Joseph had the firstborn's blessing, so his sons Manasseh and Ephraim, they were tribes. So the next 2 tribes mentioned, Manasseh's genealogy in verses 14 through 19, Ephraim's genealogy, verses 20 through 27. As a side note, a lot of times when you have the divided kingdom, Israel and Judah, Israel being the northern kingdom, when we get over to the prophets, like Isaiah, sometimes they will refer to Israel as Ephraim. So that's just another name given for Israel. Ephraim was really just one tribe of Israel. You have to really read the context to see if it's just talking about that nation as a whole. But anyway, the sons of Ephraim there in verses 20 through 27, and then the sons of Asher are in verses 30 through 40. So then we get to chapter 8. The whole chapter 8 is devoted to the sons of Benjamin. And if you notice down in verse 33, chapter 8 verse 33, it says, "And Ner beget Kish, and Kish beget Saul. And Saul beget Jonathan, and Malchishua, and Abinadab, and Eshbaal, and the son then was Meribal, and Meribal beget Micah." So a couple things to note is that Saul was man's choice for king, Israel's choice for king, the first king of Israel, but really David was God's choice. And Chronicles focuses on David, but it does mention where Saul came from. He was of Benjamin. And remember, when we looked at chapter 5 there, it said that the chief ruler came from Judah, referring to David. So even though Saul is a king, just like David was, because Saul was not God's choice, he's not mentioned as being the chief ruler here. He's just in the line here. You can see he's not of the tribe of Judah, rather he is of the tribe of Benjamin. And also an interesting point is you can see that Baal worship was going on even during Saul's day, because you see Saul beget Jonathan, and Malchishua, and Abinadab, and Eshbaal. So he names a son after Baal, and then the son of Jonathan was Meribel, which is weird because if we went through Samuel, you saw that Jonathan and David were close friends, and Jonathan was a good guy. He fought for Israel, but there was some, I don't know the story, we're not told, but there was at least some influence there in naming a child after Baal. So you see Baal worship started pretty early in Israel's history, even though you don't see it really mentioned in the days of Saul. You do see those there. So that's chapter 8. Then we get to chapter 9. Notice there, verse 1, it says, "So all Israel were reckoned by genealogies, and behold, they were written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah, who were carried away to Babylon for their transgressions." So that's it here. Israel was reckoned by their genealogies, and they're recorded here for you in those first 8 chapters, well, especially chapters 3 through 8, giving you the genealogy of those tribes. It's interesting to note that Zebulun and Dan are missing here. The genealogies, those two are not mentioned. I know Dan, he's not mentioned when you get to Revelation chapter 7 as being one of the tribes that are sealed, probably because it was one of the first places they got into idolatry. Jeroboam set up one of the golden calves in Dan. But that's just... And so that may be why it's excluded here. Zebulun, I'm not sure why they're excluded, but for whatever reason, Zebulun and Dan are not reckoned in the genealogies here in 1 Chronicles. I also wanted to mention verse 2 there in chapter 9. It says, "Now the first inhabitants that dwelt in their possessions in their cities were the Israelites, the priests, Levites, and the Nethinims." So you might think, what are the Nethinims? And if you've studied any Hebrew or so, you know of I believe it's called the Nephilim. The Nephilim in Hebrew, it refers to those supernatural creatures, those giants that were born in the days of Genesis chapter 6, where the devils had intermingled with women and created these sort of superhuman people. Those were the Nephilim. And so I wanted to mention that these here are not, this is something totally different. The Nethinims are not the Nephilim. It's the first time the Nethinims are mentioned. If you're interested about them, you can write down references. Numbers chapter 31 verse 47. Numbers chapter 31 verse 47. And also Ezra chapter 8 verse 20. Ezra chapter 8 verse 20. Those two verses will tell you from Scripture that the Nethinims were taken, basically 1 out of every 50 people of the Israelites to assist the Levites. So you had out of all those tribes that were not Levitical, they got assistants or helpers to help the Levites in their priestly duties and taking care of the house of the Lord. And those was 1 in every 50 people given to the Levites for that service. And that's who they were. So pretty much the rest of chapter 9, verses 17 through 29, give you the porters that are over the house of the Lord. And that's really all I wanted to mention there in chapter 9. When we get to chapter 10 now, from chapter 10 of 1 Chronicles all the way to the end of the book, which is chapter 29, you have the Chronicles of King David. And I wanted to just take some time, since we went over those first chapters there pretty quickly, I wanted to take some time and review to basically show you, because we went over 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we went over all those stories that were given about David and everything. And now that we're getting into Chronicles, I really wanted to go over what's not in Chronicles, just a brief overview of that and why. And the reason really is, as I mentioned before, the reason that I believe we have 1st Chronicles written as a separate account, and it's really just written from the start with being king. It's really for that time in the eternal kingdom on earth, where David is established as Israel's king forever, reigning with Jesus Christ. And it's just would be a good history book and a good reference point for the nation of Israel at that time to be reading 1st Chronicles, not necessarily reading about the history of Saul and all the conflict between Saul and David, because that's not really when the king was established. It wasn't until David actually took the throne there. And so the focus of 1st Chronicles from chapter 10 through 29 is going to be on King David, where God sees his king, David, sitting on his throne and ruling. As such, you don't see the conflicts before he was king. You don't see even his great war conquests that he had. They're almost completely skipped over in Chronicles. Whereas in 1st and 2nd Samuel, you see David, he's fighting all the time. He's a man of war, just like the Lord. But you don't really see that in Chronicles, because that time is pretty much over. When you get to the kingdom, the eternal kingdom, the war is over. Satan's defeated. He's cast in the lake of fire, or the bottomless pit, and then the lake of fire after he's released for a little season. And so David doesn't have to be fighting these battles against the nations. Rather, he's ruling as king. And so that's why you see the focus is his in Chronicles is on him on the throne, as opposed to all his battles and everything to take over territory, because the battles are over in that eternal kingdom as far as taking territory over is concerned. So that's completely skipped over, for the most part skipped over. And so really we only see it after David's kingdom is established. So let's go back to 1 Samuel, and we'll just briefly go over the things that you're not going to see in 1 Chronicles. And hopefully with that frame of reference in mind, you'll see the connection and you'll say, okay, yeah, I see we're not told about that because David isn't on set, or that's not an official act of the king there in 1st or 2nd Samuel. So that's why it's not mentioned. So David really appears first in 1 Samuel chapter 16. You have David in verses 1 through 13 is anointed king by Samuel, but the nation of Israel does not recognize him. The nation as a whole does not recognize him as king yet, even though God does. And so because of the nation of Israel not recognizing him as a whole, that's skipped over in Chronicles. Then you have the battles between David and Saul, starting in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, verses 14 through 23, where an evil spirit was coming upon Saul because he's no longer God's anointed. David plays a harp to soothe him. That's not mentioned in 1 Chronicles. Chapter 17, the famous passage of David defeating Goliath. Most famous story of David at all. Not mentioned in 1 Chronicles. He's not on the throne yet. He's fighting for the nation of Israel. Chapter 18, you have David and Jonathan's close friendship. You have women of Israel praising David. And then you have, because the women of Israel are praising David more than Saul, then you have some conflicts there between Saul and David. Notice there's a threefold attack, and I really don't want to get into too much detail, but I think this is worth mentioning. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, Saul tries to kill David in 3 different ways. First, he tries to use things. He used things to try to kill David. Chapter 18, verse 10, it says, "And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice." So Saul tries to kill the javelin there, verses 10 through 11, by using, in other words, using things. Then, and that doesn't work. So then in verses 12 through 16, Saul tries to kill David by using men. In other words, he sends David out into battle, hoping that other men, the enemy, will kill him. That doesn't work. And so then in verses 17 through 30, Saul tries to kill David by having him marry his daughter. In other words, get his daughter to coerce David, onto Saul's side. And that was really an attack of David's inner man. So you had the threefold attack of Saul against David, using things, using men, and attacking the inner man. And I mention that because Satan has similar attacks today. The threefold attack of Satan today is that when you preach God's word, the truth, rightfully divided, and you're preaching that and it's getting out there, Satan doesn't like it. He wants the truth to be masked. He wants people to listen to the ministers of Satan, where Satan's transformed into an angel of light, and you think you're listening to the truth, but you're really not. So listening to the truth, Satan has basically 3 ways where he tries to stop it. First, he'll attack the message. That would be equivalent to using things, where the Bible rightly divided, where he'll say, well, the big scholars of today, the mega churches, or everybody that you hear, no one follows the Bible rightly divided like that. You're just a little cult with your little, the way you're teaching things. And so that's the way they attack the message. Then the second one would be with the people, using people, which would be getting people to abandon the man and the message. So, if the man will keep preaching the message, even though he's attacked, well then, Satan will try to take away his audience. You can see that any place where the Bible is taught rightly divided and the truth is taught, there are good churches like that. It's always just a little remnant, a little flock, and so hoping to get the man discouraged. So he's teaching the truth, but if he's only teaching it to 3 or 4 or 5, 20 people, how many ever, maybe it'll discourage him and stop teaching the message. And then the third way of attack then would be attacking the messenger, attacking the character of the man. In other words, attacking the inner man. So if Satan can't destroy the message, if he can't destroy the guy, the people around him, his support system, such that he destroys that and he's still teaching the message, well then he'll try to get him to stray away from the truth and attack the inner man, and so that he won't be as effective. And so really Satan isn't doing anything new today. It's just he's subtle, wise, and crafty in what he does, so he does things maybe a little differently and masks it and try to make it look like the truth. But really, Satan is doing the same attacks today, just in different forms as he was back then. And you can see the threefold attack there of Saul there in chapter 18 of 1 Samuel corresponds with Satan's threefold attack of the truth today. So in chapter 19, you have again Saul trying to kill David with the javelin. Again, this Saul and David, these interactions aren't in 1 Chronicles. Then you have Michal, which was David's wife, helps David escape. And then finally in 1 Samuel 19, God helps David escape. Again, you don't find that in 1 Chronicles. Chapter 20, you have Jonathan having to abandon David due to Saul's anger. Jonathan and David part ways. Jonathan's not mad at David. It's just Saul's trying to kill David, and so Jonathan parts ways with him. And so God's having David separated from his friend there, again to try to attack David there. You don't see that in 1 Chronicles. The attacks of Satan aren't going to be found in after he is cast into the lake of fire, or when he's in the bottomless pit. He's not there to attack, and so since he won't be there to attack in the kingdom, you don't have it mentioned in 1 Chronicles. Chapters 21 and 22 of 1 Samuel, you have David on the run from Saul. Again, you won't have Satan attacking there in the kingdom, so those are omitted. 1 Samuel chapter 23, it's interesting, verses 1 through 5, you have David. He's still doing the Lord's work even when he's on the run from Saul. He's attacking and killing the enemies of God even when Saul won't do it, and he's doing it while he's on the run from Saul. And then the rest of chapter 23 and chapter 24 is David on the run from Saul. Again, not mentioned in 1 Chronicles. Chapter 25, you see that pattern where David is again doing the Lord's work in 1 Samuel 25, but Saul is, right after, he's still on the run from Saul, but he's still doing the Lord's work, even though Saul isn't. David is still doing that work, but without the attacks of the enemy in that kingdom, then that one's omitted as well. 1 Samuel chapter 26, David on the run from Saul. 1 Samuel 27, David hides from Saul among Saul's enemies. He's hiding with the Philistines. Most of chapter 28 of 1 Samuel is all about Saul seeking a familiar spirit. The Lord isn't with Saul at the time because he's with David. David is the Lord's anointed, and so Saul goes to a familiar spirit. Again, you're not going to have that in the kingdom reign, so it's not included in 1 Chronicles. 1 Samuel chapter 29, you have the enemy separates from David, and again, you won't have that in that rule and reign in the kingdom. Chapter 30, David does the Lord's work, and then finally chapter 31. Chapter 31 is mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, and that's where Saul dies. Saul dies, paving the way for David, and since that's God's king and he's going to be anointed there, you have a little brief introduction to that for chapter 10. But then you go back to chapter 2, you go to 2 Samuel chapter 1, and chapters 1 through 3, I believe it is, are not mentioned in 1 Chronicles. Actually, chapters 1 through 4 of 2 Samuel, because you have chapter 1 is the news of Saul's death, David lamenting over Saul's death, and then chapter 2 through 4 is a little struggle between Israel, even though Judah, the tribes of Judah, have anointed David as their king. Upon Saul's death, you have some rebellion among Israel where they're trying to get Saul's son to sit on the throne, and you won't have a rebellion like that in the coming kingdom, and so that's cut out of 1 Chronicles. So then when you get to 2 Samuel chapter 5, that's where you have finally 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 1. It says, Then came all the tribes of Israel to David unto Hebron, and spake, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. So that's where the whole anoints David as king, and that's when finally the story of David in Chronicles starts. So you have all that skipped there, his childhood, what he does with Goliath, and the going back and forth between Saul and David, and even when he gets to be king in Judah, the turmoil between Israel and Judah. There was war. I think in if you look at 2 Samuel chapter 3 verse 1, it says, Now there was long war between the house of Saul and David. There's not going to be a war in the kingdom, in the eternal kingdom, and the war is over. Christ is won, Satan's lost, and David is just going to be there ruling with the Lord, ruling with a rod of iron, to making sure people keep in line in their kingdom. But Satan's kingdom is gone, and so the war is over, and so that's not mentioned in 1 Chronicles. And so just wanted to mention all that, a lot of that detail there that we've went over, and 1 Samuel especially, and then those first few chapters of 2 Samuel just aren't found in. And it's not that God forgot them or God doesn't think they're important, because he does mention them, but it's just, I think the focus of Chronicles is that eternal kingdom of Israel. And so it starts right with Adam, showing how Israel comes in, how the genealogy works from the first man all the way to Israel, shows all the tribes, and then it sets you up, and boom, it goes right into the first king, God's choice for king, David. And it skips all that Saul and the battle, and of course Saul being a type of the Antichrist and David being a type of the Christ, and the battle between Christ and the Antichrist, sort of, that's all over in that kingdom. Christ is won, Satan's lost, and so you don't see that battle going on in 1 Chronicles as you did in 1 Samuel and part of 2 Samuel. So that's the reason you have First Chronicles. And just to continue there, what also is not mentioned is, even though David is anointed king in 2 Samuel chapter 5, and that's where there are some things that he does that aren't really kingly. It's not that God is going to omit sins that he does because he wants David to be shown as perfect. He's not trying to show a vision of David that he never attained to. He's just trying to show what he did in a kingly capacity. And so some things that he didn't do, that really weren't related to him ruling as king in that eternal kingdom, when he gets to that point, it's just skipped over. And so examples of that would be 2 Samuel chapter 9 is not mentioned in 1 Chronicles. That's where David shows kindness to Jonathan's son Mephibosheth. Saul being a type of Satan, then that line there, the generation of vipers that are talked about in Jesus' day, they're all done away with. They're not there in the kingdom. So Mephibosheth, and his line there, Saul there, would be in there. So it's not mentioned in 1 Chronicles. Chapters 11 and 12 of 2 Samuel over David's sin with the adultery he committed with Bathsheba, and then having Uriah killed, and then also his repentance of that. That's not mentioned in 1 Chronicles. That's another big story. Probably the biggest story of David is him killing Goliath, and the second biggest is Bathsheba, the adultery there, and him having Uriah killed. Those aren't mentioned in Chronicles. It's not that God is saying, well, I want my king to look good, because as we'll see when we go through Chronicles, he doesn't omit every bad thing David does, but it's just that wasn't something he would do in his kingly capacity. That was something he did after he was king, true, but he was just doing as a man in the flesh. And so that's skipped over. Let's see, what else? And then God's judgment of David really is the rest of 2 Samuel, chapters 13 through all the way down to chapter 23, verse 7, where God judges David for Bathsheba and Uriah. God doesn't have to judge David in the kingdom because he's already received the atonement. When Jesus comes back, Acts chapter 3, verse 19 says that he will. That's the times of refreshing come from the